Well, hey everybody, this is Robert and welcome to Outbreak News TV. And today we'll be doing a special live stream and the topic will be polio. And what we're going to look at, among other things, is history, vaccines, and what's going on right now with the current global situation and some of the challenges, because polio has really become a situation in the news again in 2024. And joining me today, I have two fantastic guests to talk about this important topic. First, I have actually a first-time guest, Andrea Prinzi, PhD. Dr. Prinzi is a field medical director of U.S. Medical Affairs with bioMérieux Incorporated. And also I have a frequent guest on the program, Rodney Rohde, PhD. And Dr. Rohde is the Associate Director of the Translational Health Research Initiative and the chair of the Medical Laboratory Science Program at Texas State University. Welcome all to the live stream.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Okay, excellent. Let's go ahead and start out with just some information about the virus itself. The polio virus. Can you talk about the virus, and can you talk about the pathology that goes along with this can be very traumatic virus?
Rodney, you want to go first? You want me to jump in?
Let's let you start off, and then I'll make any comments if you have anything different.
Okay, sure. So just in a very simple, easy to understand summary, poliovirus is a member of the enterovirus genus. So I think folks are probably pretty familiar with hearing enterovirus. We see enterovirus as a whole causing all sorts of clinical disease. It can cause respiratory symptoms. It can cause some neurological symptoms, can present in various different disease states depending on the type you have. But poliovirus specifically is the one that we think about that can cause paralytic disease in some cases. That's primarily spread through the fecal-oral route. So we see this in areas where there's generally poor hygiene or not great access to clean water, or subpar living conditions. It's ingested, and then the virus actually does most of its replication and does most of its work sort of in the gut. So that's where it does most of its dividing and then can spread from there, depending on how it moves through the body. And then in some cases, like I said, it can get into the nerves and can cause paralytic disease.
Right. You got anything to add, Rodney?
Yeah, just all that. And one interesting note, it's also in the family Picornaviridae, which means small RNA virus. So I know a lot of people in the public now are paying attention to RNA viruses, whether it's SARS-CoV-2 or rabies or any of the others that are out there. So it's a common virus that, fortunately, through vaccination and other routes, we've kind of limited that spread. But we'll get into that, I know, as we move along.
All right, excellent. So who's most at risk for this disease?
Yeah, so, due to typically what you see with this virus is typically it's going to be picking on primarily immunocompromised populations, but also young. So a lot of times you're seeing children and others, that everywhere from infants all the way up through, teenage years and things like that. So that's typically the most impacted population. And as Dr. Prinzi mentioned, since it's primarily a fecal-oral route, you can imagine that being a problem, especially in communities or regions where there might be some issues with hygiene and water pollution, and even issues with water purity overall. So it's typically going to hit hardest in those regions.
Yeah, and we've noticed in recent days or weeks, we've seen polio virus being detected in water samples in Europe now, right? So it's becoming a bigger potential problem. How do you test for polio virus? Because you always see confirmed cases. How are they actually testing for it?
Yeah, I'll jump on this just because I used to do it. So in the first part of my career, for 10 years, I worked for the Department of Health in Texas and Austin, and it was a fantastic training opportunity and workplace because I worked in a virus isolation lab And it was interesting because we kind of did old school. It's still gold standard, by the way, but we would take primarily fecal samples, occasionally other types of samples, and you would treat those samples to get rid of bacteria and things like that with certain procedures, and then you would inoculate cell cultures. And so most viruses, if you want to amplify them, actual grow them, you do that in a cell culture system. And so you do that for a day or so, sometimes shorter, and then you would test for one of the three polio types using a simple monoclonal antibody, immunofluorescent test, where you take the cells, if you can imagine the cells on the slide, and an antibody that you purchase, and if it's the right fit, it would stick to the poliovirus antigens, and on the top of that antibody, you would have what's called a floor. And if that connection was there, if it was specific enough, you'd sit under a UV microscope and it would light up kind of this brilliant apple green fluorescent sky, and you knew that that was positive. Now we know in today's world that doesn't work well for rapid testing and things like that. So there are absolute more quick, more powerful tests that are molecular based, PCR based tests. And there are some, I was looking around, Robert, before the podcast here, there are some rapid tests that are being developed, but they're still not the primary type of test you would consider for ultimate diagnosis and typing, but they might be useful for, say, in a big outbreak where you're just trying to screen for potential positives.
Actually, that's a great point, because I would add to that. I think this is one of those diseases where we think about diagnostics being interesting, because even if you look at like CDC's website for polio diagnostics, right, like the standard is still to culture the virus, and then they can do sequencing afterwards to determine, if it's which kind of type of polio it is, and if it's, vaccine derived or otherwise, or they can kind of figure it out from there. But the recommendation is still to culture it. So it's one of the few things I think there's other things that fall in this camp, but it's one of those things that we don't really have like a rapid diagnostic for that we're using right now in the field to rapidly detect poliovirus. It really does need to be grown, and then they can sort it out from there. So that's interesting. And I was lucky enough to do cell culture too when I started my clinical job. Yeah, I did it for, I think 4 or 5 years before we got rid of it, which was such a cool experience, because you don't really get that experience anymore.
I always tell my students that I'm sad that they don't get to train on that. And we still use it in research and things like that. So every once in a while, a student will still get to understand how to use it. But it's a fascinating area, when you're talking about CPE and cytopathic effect and things like that. So it's still out there. It's just not as current as it used to be.
Well, and one interesting factoid for like a piece of history there is and we'll get to Salk later, but when Salk and Sabin and all these virologists and researchers at the time were, in this race to discover, how to grow poliovirus and then how to come up with a vaccine for poliovirus, they were really struggling with finding the cell type that they could grow the virus in, and then what could be used in a vaccine to give to humans. And so they were successful early on with some like monkey cells, but there was a lot of concern about how that would actually play out when injected into a human. And so there's several people that were responsible for the discovery of how to grow poliovirus in human cell lines that were, a little more agreeable, that we don't always hear about quite as much. So I think that's interesting. There was a lot of work initially done to figure out which cell lines the virus could grow in. And that's a lot of what we're still doing today. And, it's been modified over time, but that actually happened during that big, polio discovery phase in the United States.
Yeah, I can remember one of my first interviews ever was with Vincent Racaniello. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he ran quite a prominent polio lab for decades. And he showed me a picture of just stack after stack after stack of cell cultures. The incubator was just like filled to the brim. So
that was my entire morning, was reading the cell cultures. And it's such a great learning, phase. We could do a whole show on cell culture for sure.
So is there a treatment for polio? We know there's a vaccine to prevent it, but is there a treatment for it?
There's no cure, and there's really no treatment. You can read about interesting approaches to treatment. Over time, people have done things like hot springs and, spasm drugs to kind of help people, not have muscle spasms, things like that. But there really is nothing you can do except prevent. That is the biggest treatment.
You're really just treating symptoms, right? So sometimes
Yeah.
you might be sent for physical therapy, for example, if someone's dealing with polio, or antispasm types of drugs. So unfortunately, no, it's really more about preventing.
Now, we have two polio endemic countries still around, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we still see wild polio virus reported from those countries. But in a bunch of countries in Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, some in Asia, we see a variant virus. Can either of you discuss what's the difference between wild polio virus and the variant versions?
I can take a general stab, and then Dr. Rohde can add in if he likes. So this is another really fascinating thing that's a bit unique to poliovirus, where we've got two really wonderful routes of vaccine administration that function a bit differently. So you've got your injectable vaccine that is not a live virus, and then oral polio vaccine that is live. And they're used for different reasons. So the injectable one came out first, or the not live virus vaccine came out first, really did a great job of, helping end what was a giant pandemic at the time. But the oral polio vaccine, because it's live, because it does get shed in the stool of folks that receive it, it actually is great at completely interrupting outbreaks. And so it's also cheaper. It's easy to use. And so this has been used in areas where there's major outbreaks, but because it does get shed, what can happen is in areas where there are low vaccination rates, particularly in groups of children like under the age of 5, so children 5 or less are at highest risk, they can obtain or get infected with that vaccine strain of polio, which then can essentially mutate into a form that could be the paralytic version. So you kind of have this separate outbreak occurring that is a result of the vaccination, but that's not to say that the vaccination is not needed or helping. It's that in these weird, instances where you might have lower levels of immunized populations, there might be a risk of acquiring polio from that vaccine strain.
But essentially, though, the disease is the same, though, right?
Yeah. Yes. Rodney, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, it's the pathology is similar.
Yeah.
My knowledge, it's typically it can vary. It can even vary in wild type, and so there's kind of a range and spectrum of disease and pathology. It really gets into where the virus ultimately ends up and does most of its damage. And of course, if it's in the central nervous system, you're going to get kind of different spectrums versus gastrointestinal. It does always make me think of, though, when Dr. Prinzi was talking about this, because again, virology is one of my primary areas, and I always tell people, it's one of the most fascinating areas of what I think in microbiology, but it's also one of the most diabolical. It's just, viruses are they're fascinating to me, and I think a lot of virologists are, but they're also devastating in many instances and diabolical. So I often tell people that, sometimes I have to remind myself, whether I was working in rabies or other types of viral outbreaks, is that, they're so interesting. And you might see Andrea and I kind of getting excited talking about them because they are really interesting things to study, but they are diabolical many times, especially RNA viruses. They just have this ability to mutate and change. And as the world has witnessed in the last 5 years, it's difficult to stay ahead of them. We're getting better at it, but it's really difficult to stay ahead of viruses, especially. They're just nasty creatures at times.
For sure. And I think I would probably have to fact check myself on this, but I do think that the vaccine-derived poliovirus strain that we see is, it's an attenuated virus, version in the vaccine. And I don't think that you can just pick it up from the wastewater or whatever, and it just happens, it pathophysiologically happens in the same way as we see happen with the wild poliovirus. I actually think there has to be sort of a mutation that happens. We should double check that, but I think there's a mutation that has to happen when people, acquire that version of poliovirus. It's not exactly the same sort of route methodology in the body as wild poliovirus, but yes, if people do contract that and it develops, mutates, does whatever it does, you can develop pretty much an identical disease depending on where it goes in the body. Like like Dr. Rohde said, if it goes into the nervous system, you can get paralytic polio, et cetera. So yes, something that they're working on because it certainly does cause disease.
Yeah. Now, smallpox has been eradicated, and I guess the race for number 2 for many years now has been guinea worm disease versus polio, and they're both, but polio backslid a little bit this year. But the fact is that there's 3 serotypes of wild polio virus, and 2 of them have actually been eradicated. Can either of you talk about that for the audience?
I think it's pretty amazing to look at the work that was done, oh my gosh, since the original vaccine trials, but then especially since the 80s by large global organizations. I think, you've got Gavi, UNICEF, oh gosh, Bill and Melinda Gates. Yeah. Putting a ton of resources into completely eradicating the disease. And through that work, I believe we've completely gotten rid of serotype 2 and 3, right? So
Correct.
wild poliovirus 1 is the one that is still around in Afghanistan and Pakistan as an endemic.
Yeah.
Wild poliovirus. Yeah.
Anything to add, Rodney, on that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That serotype 1 is still around, and interestingly, if you look kind of at some of it's been more current, right? Right up into the 2000s, we still had some of it circulating. So it's interesting that we got that one primary type, and of course we got the vaccine variant that we're kind of watching as well. But again, thinking of viruses and thinking kind of historically, I always think about, people always bring up smallpox, and one of the things I try to remind the public about is that smallpox was primarily a host dependent virus. And so once you got all humans vaccinated around the world, which was an amazing global feat when you think about going into certain parts of the world, I think one of the difficulties with polio or guinea worm or any of the others, measles, measles are primarily a human host derived agent. You would think we could eliminate measles, but there's all sorts of issues with vaccination, we know, but there's also issues of just getting into those countries now, into those regions. Again, war, conflict, political unrest, refugees going back and forth across borders and things like that. I think it's a more difficult issue in 2020, 2024 as we move forward to kind of deal with all of that.
Yeah, perhaps. I can remember, I don't know if it was 15 or 20 years ago, you would look at the polio numbers, and India would have like 350,000 cases. And then by 2011, it was a wrap.
Mm-hmm.
Totally successful, and it hasn't returned. So it's definitely doable.
It is doable.
If India can do it, anybody can do it, because they had by far the worst, as far as I can recall.
Yes, I jotted some numbers down that I thought were great just on this topic. It says, let's see, I wrote down wild poliovirus cases have decreased by over 99% since 1988, which is amazing, from an estimated 350,000 cases in more than 125 endemic countries to 6 reported cases in 2021. So like you're saying, they're just like straight down.
That's crazy.
And then it goes more into what was eradicated. So if that doesn't speak to the power of the vaccines, I don't know, what does.
And I believe 1988 was the year that the Global Polio Eradication Initiative started, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, let's go into a little bit of history. And for the audience, I will link to Dr. Prinzi and Dr. Rohde's paper on polio. But they do discuss history a good bit, and I find that very interesting. So can either of you, one of you, both of you, give us a little rundown on the history of polio?
I'm going to definitely punt this to Dr. Prinzi. I love it too. I love the history of microbiology, but I'm going to let her go for it because she took over this section on this paper.
Okay, fill in anything I miss, Dr. Rohde.
Absolutely.
I love infectious diseases history. So anytime we do an ASM article, I'm like, let's start with who's the first person that wrote about this thing? I love trying to understand, I think it's interesting that history always repeats itself. it's very interesting to look at how these things have presented over time and how they've been handled. Poliovirus, I feel like, is a bit different again, because it's a very ancient disease. It was not well documented until the 19th century, but there are all sorts of interesting clues from the past that suggest this has been around for a very, very long time. So, there's like ancient Egyptian art that shows these classic characteristics of a person that has paralytic polio. So their legs look very atrophied and they have a cane, and suggesting that it was probably endemic and it causing all sorts of disease, back then, but we just don't have a lot of documentation of that. And then this is an interesting trajectory, because I think typically when we see hygiene improve over time in countries as they become more advanced or they acquire more status or wealth or what have you, that we see disease tend to drop, infectious diseases anyway. And this was an interesting kind of, the reverse was true. We saw all this industrialization happen. And so people started crowding together a lot more. And we saw a lot more, like in the 1800s, outbreaks of polio happening. And that made sense because people were crowding, people were close, and conditions were relatively not hygienic, right? And so that would be expected. And then interestingly, the US got hit really the hardest first, because there was this push for hygiene, cleanliness is godliness kind of, ideology happening. And children especially were not being exposed, or this is at least the theory, children weren't really being exposed to this, from either birth or through breastfeeding. Mothers that had been exposed to polio, maybe later in their life and had developed maybe like flu-like illness, hadn't gotten severe disease, and then were able to pass on some sort of immunity to their babies. But when everything got really clean, this wasn't really happening anymore. People weren't getting as exposed. And so this actually, they think, contributed to this really significant spike in the 1900s in the US, which is where we started seeing these really huge outbreaks. And then there's a great book I'd like to recommend to anyone that's listening. It's called Polio, An American Story by David Oshinsky. This is an amazing book on the story of polio in the United States. You'll probably see lots of little references to things that are brought up in that book in our ASM article, but just the story of why there was so much support behind polio in the US is really fascinating. The president, so FDR, had polio and actually was in a wheelchair. And at the time that was very stigmatized. And so there was a lot of work going on to kind of hide his disability and then to, get support behind the disease that had caused his disability. He did a ton of fundraising. He had a rich lawyer friend, Basil O'Connor, who started this huge fundraising campaign. They would raise money on the president's birthday for polio. They would do all of these things to get support for polio. And so because of all of this, and because it was impacting upper middle class residents, unfortunately, I think that's why it got a lot more attention. And so there's this really interesting socio-political dynamic to polio in the US that's really fascinating. So just a little bit of the history there.
I love that you cited that book. I turned to look, if you notice, and it's sitting on my bookshelf. It's interesting you have that book. I've read it many years ago, but yeah, it's just an overall fascinating thing. And I see, if you're out there watching, you see how animated Dr. Prinzi gets on this topic, and I so appreciate it, because sometimes when I'm home or I'm talking to friends or something and I go down this road about the history of anything, for me it's rabies is kind of my big thing, right? And so it's just an interesting thing when you kind of tie history, politically, socially, geographically, everything that's gone on in the world, and tie it to infectious diseases. And as you guys both know, you can look historically through conquest of military, right, and how population spread because of infectious diseases. So it's just a fascinating area, even for, I think, the general audience, if they take some time to look at some of these great books and articles.
The interesting thing that Dr. Prinzi talked about was what I think some people would consider an irony.
Yeah.
About the improved hygiene versus the polio spread. When I saw that in your article, I saw the headline, I'm like, what on earth are they talking about?
Yeah.
And then it made total sense.
Yeah.
It's so bizarre to think that, all of us, right? All we talk about with infection prevention is hygiene. I still do it with healthcare associated infections and, all the things, good hand washing, all that makes sense. And it's true. It's absolutely true. But because of what Dr. Prinzi talked about, when sanitation, standards kind of rose through that time, what happened is infants were, just way more or less likely to be exposed to the polio virus, interestingly enough. And so they had their maternal antibodies kind of protecting them. And then all of a sudden, later in their childhood, because they hadn't had that actual exposure and their immunity was waning, in many ways, it kind of backfired, but I think we both would still say hygiene is really critical, and generally it's very important. But now that we know that, we can kind of watch for that.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful with that messaging, because there's a lot of rhetoric now around like, oh, like we need
just
to be
let the kids do whatever they
just
want.
Let the kids be like sick, and then everything will be fine. I just think it's important to note that for some infectious diseases, we see different trends based on exposure. And so we've seen this after COVID. We've seen this after years of isolation, these different trends in certain diseases that just like spiked like crazy because of the lack of exposure previously. Obviously there's a risk benefit equation to take into account there, but it's just really fascinating here, because I think it's one of those things where obviously living in squalor and being in cramped conditions and having polio spreading among the community is not a good thing. So the cleanliness was wonderful, but it had a tremendous impact, right, on people, because it really did reduce the level of maternal protection and things.
It's one of those weird little quirks for a particular disease. I always tell people too, to be same thing. You'll hear people say that you need to expose your babies, your children to everything. And I'm like, well, right. I mean, some diseases will actually kill your child on first exposure. So that's not quite the truth, right? So you definitely want to understand what's going on when it comes to vaccines and hygiene and those types of things. But interesting quirk with this one.
Yeah. And I just want to put out there, I see we have a few people viewing. And if you have a question for one of our experts or a comment, go ahead and just type it into the appropriate spot on YouTube, and we'll put it out there and make them work for their money. What is the March of Dimes?
Ooh, I love
what
this
is
picture.
the March of Dimes?
So I'll just add a little bit to the little historical table, and then so when I talked about Roosevelt had this friend, Basil O'Connor, who was an American lawyer. That is who he teamed up with to start fundraising for the vaccine development and research effort for polio. And Basil O'Connor, this is really one of the most brilliant examples of marketing, one of the first solid examples of heavy duty marketing to the American public in the US. He started this whole event basically where, first it started with, we're going to celebrate the president's birthday, celebrate him by donating money to the polio cause, and people would send money to the White House. And then he's like, well, we're not really reaching everybody out there. Like, you've got people that can't afford very much, but could give a dime. They could send a dime in to help support this cause. And so they started this whole campaign that was, send whatever dimes you have. We'll take 1 dime. We'll take 100 dimes. Send them to the White House. Send them to this organization he started for paralytic polio, and it became known as the March of Dimes. And this organization, led by Basil O'Connor, truly, started collaborating with the scientists that were developing the vaccine and everything, and supporting their efforts. And that's actually most of the monetary support for this stuff came from the March of Dimes effort and that group that he was running in his philanthropy there.
Yeah, and a lot of that funding, I think I remember, led to Salk's funding some of his research to really get that whole effort for vaccination going. So, I mean, what a monumental historical moment for FDR, and probably didn't even think, at the time that it was going to be what it became. But again, I think in the paper, you'll see Dr. Prinzi mentions this, that it's, you just never know, right? I mean, the power of people and wanting to help a cause is, it really set the stage for helping eliminate polio.
Yeah.
In fact, polio is such a good example of what can be done if people come together to put resources behind a cause. This one was kind of the perfect storm of, like I said, for unfortunately, things tend to get more attention when important people are affected or when people of importance have been impacted. Importance is a term that people can define on their own, but generally speaking, at the time, this was like a high profile person had gotten polio. Children were being affected. Generally, when children get sick, we care a lot more about children because people have a soft spot for children more so typically than adults. And so there was just a lot behind that. And then, marketing hadn't really been done in this way before. So they were like storytelling with disease, using pictures of children with paralytic polio, using stories to inspire people to donate, telling them, they could. And it's amazing the level of support they got from this and what they were able to do with that money is pretty wild.
Yep.
And the March of Dimes still exists to this day. Am I right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. I remember what's amazing is I remember listening to my dad years and years ago. He was born in 1924, so he remembers the long line
Right.
to get the vaccine because people actually saw children with paralysis,
Right.
Yes.
people in an iron lung,
Yes.
Right.
and they wanted to get vaccinated. I mean,
Right.
nobody wanted to go through that.
Yeah.
So,
It's interesting. I think I've told you before, Robert, in one of our other conversations, my grandmother, she lived to be 101, and she was born in the 1890s. And man, I miss her. Great conversations because I mean, if you sit with some, I always tell my students, talk to your grandparents now, and talk to them about living in a world where they were in fear. My grandmother lost a child in childbirth. And so there's all these things that we just take for granted, I think, nowadays. And so historically, again, great lessons to learn when you look at vaccinations and infectious diseases. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of vaccinations, who's Jonas Salk?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at Jonas. So again, as that March of Dimes time period, was kind of thinking about that time. So polio was definitely a super feared disease because of that impact on children, because of paralysis. You can imagine how parents were terrified of that. And through the late 19th century all the way into the 20th century, just desperately trying to think of things to find a vaccine. And so really the first breakthrough occurred right after World War II. So in 1949, a trio of Boston Children's Hospital individuals, John Enders, Thomas Weller, and Frederick Robbins, were the first, we think, that documented anyway, to grow poliovirus in human tissue. So that whole conversation we had about cell culture, this was a huge deal at the time. And so that meant you could grow the virus, which meant now you could study it in more detail. And now you had a virus that you could kill or weaken to start trying different types of vaccines. So those three people that we talked about, they actually got a 1954 Nobel Prize for that. And then after that, a lady named Isabel Morgan and Dorothy Horseman came along, and they were real instrumental in kind of this journey towards a polio vaccine. Morgan's work kind of helped understand the three different types that we mentioned, different serotypes, 1, 2, and 3, and helped kind of determine that a killed virus could be used for effective vaccinations, and ultimately might need a booster dose. So we've heard a lot about boosters during COVID. So sometimes you need a booster later down the road to kind of jumpstart your immunity. And then Horseman came along and really elucidated that it was all about the gastrointestinal tract, which helped really lead to an oral vaccine. But Salk, kind of throughout that time period, had been following this and working on it. And ultimately, once that cell culture came along, research could really get rocking and rolling, and vaccination efforts could start working. And so Salk was really the first to work along an inactivated killed virus vaccine. He was a physician in the United States. And in 1953, believe this or not, this is always interesting in history to me, Salk tested the vaccine on himself and his family. Thanks, Dad. Right. So he tested it on his children who had actually recovered from polio and could see antibody levels kind of bouncing up after vaccination. So a lot of that early work, and we won't go through all of that, but a lot of that early work, he was checking all that out. And then about a year after he did it on himself and his family, one of the first largest field trials, at least in medical history in the U.S., was conducted, and he tested it over about 1 million children, and he used the U.S., he used Canada and Finland, and ultimately showed that that vaccine was safe, that it was about 90% efficacious against serotypes 2 and 3, and a little bit less against type 1, which is, again, kind of linked back to why that's still somehow popping up. So over that time, by 1961, cases had fallen to about 161 per year compared to about 20,000 cases about a decade earlier. So kind of a walk through history. Again, the paper takes you through that a little more in detail, but Salk is definitely, and I remember my grandmother telling me that there were ticker tape parades in New York City. I mean, we didn't see that for the mRNA vaccine, or so we kind of take these things for granted, right? But I mean, people were beyond excited and so happy, to get their children vaccinated for polio at the time.
Yeah, and you both mentioned some major players in the attempt to eradicate polio, but even today, there's still other major players. Now we have Rotary International. Are there other ones that you guys know of that are big into polio? Because you notice that as it gets closer to eradication, it doesn't seem to be so many people in on it anymore, right? Or am I misinterpreting that?
I mean, I don't know if Dr. Prinzi has any thoughts on that, but I mean, generally, even in my lifetime, over 30 years, sometimes when you're actually successful, the things like research funds kind of get diverted different ways, and people start working on the next newest diabolical, interesting virus. So I'm not aware, other than the Rotary Club and some of the big organization that started in '88. That is, I'm sure there are some players out there doing individual research.
Well, even I go back to Dr. Raccaniello's lab. I know it eventually stopped doing polio research, and he went into enteroviruses, I think, or something. I remember he was telling me that some years ago. I think he's doing all media now. I'm not really sure.
I know when I was working on my master's my master's degree from 90 to 92, that was the model we used. I was actually, the work I was doing was antiviral compounds against a virus model, and my thesis advisor was using polio, so I worked with it early in my career, but he switched to, eventually he moved to different types of viruses in the 2000s and things.
Yeah.
Sorry, Robert. I was just going to say, for modern people, to add to that, I mean, I think Rotary, obviously, I think Gavi has stepped up more, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has always been like very consistent, and I think consistently is. And then the only other historical one I would mention is Sabin, obviously, because he's the oral polio. But I would say, if you read that book that we were talking about earlier, there is such an interesting discussion on sadly, the contentiousness between those two researchers. And I think it's a great example. It is a wonderful example of how science is iterative and how it's additive and it builds on itself. And people need to remember that the first version of a vaccine may not be perfect or may have one use, and then another vaccine may serve another use, and together they're going to end. And we've seen that we need both versions of this vaccine, right, to really end it. And it's sad that they had such a contentious back and forth during their lifetime, because afterward is when it was really demonstrated that both together.
It's such a great point. It's such a great point. It always makes me think of this too, and I'm reading about it, because this is not right. HIV had the same issues with Gallo, and so you always have, we're humans, and every one of us have egos, and scientists can have egos, and that's not a bad thing, right? Sometimes it means they're driven and they find great things, but you do hope that people find a way to synergize the effects, because certainly the oral polio, we definitely want to give Sabin credit for what he did, because that truly helped eliminate kind of the chain of transmission somewhat, using that live attenuated vaccine, the oral polio vaccine. So both are equally, I think, effective and important in different ways, but together,
different utilities,
really powerful.
Okay, we already, Dr. Prinzi talked about a little bit about the two polio vaccines. Did you guys want to add anything else to that? The inactivated versus the oral?
No, just that it's important to note that there's different uses for them, but that they both are important. In the US, we don't use oral polio vaccine. It's primarily reserved for areas where there might be where it's more accessible for one, because it is cheaper and easier to use, but where
Right.
they might need to disrupt an outbreak,
Yeah.
that's where it would be used. Whereas here we all get, we try to maintain a herd immunity by using our not live virus injection.
Right.
Let's talk about the current global situation. And in 2024, there's been a surge in wild polio virus in the 2 endemic countries. I don't know if there's 90 total between the 2 countries. I think something like that, as compared to 12 total cases all of last year. What's going on? Why are we seeing this sudden increase in cases in 2024 after we haven't seen these numbers in 4 or 5 years?
I'll take a quick stab at it, and then I know Dr. Prinzi might have a comment or two. I think, going back to what I said earlier, and there may be other factors, but I really think, if you think about the last, it's been politically tough, right? I'm talking about war and things that can create environments in different parts of the world that really help pathogens and infectious disease. So when you think about wars, especially, you can think about right now, thinking about Ukraine, and you think about places that are really in the midst of devastating war and other types of political uproar and things like that. Sometimes your water systems break down. Certainly healthcare is a problem. It's already tough in those environments anyway, sometimes, to get in and do vaccination campaigns or even treatments, and just general healthcare. So I think, in my opinion, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, I think it's going to be an ongoing effort, and the global community is going to have to really examine that. If we really are trying to ultimately eliminate polio, we're going to have to figure out how to set aside time or set aside differences to occasionally allow Gavi and other types of health entities to go in and try to vaccinate an area that might have a small outbreak going on. I think it's a difficult issue.
Yeah. And there's particular situations I read about on a pretty regular basis, like in Pakistan, where vaccinators and their security are being mowed down. It's like, what's going on?
Yeah. It's interesting because the World Health Organization has a line on one of their emergency polio meeting summary documents, or something. It's called something more eloquent than that. It's just remembering it. It has a better title than that. But they make a statement about how, as long as there is wild polio virus transmission in those 2 countries, the whole globe isn't safe, right? Because we can certainly have people moving from place to place and potentially introducing this into areas where vaccination rates may be decreasing, and then reintroducing disease, et cetera. They have not specifically said why, one particular reason why it's so explosive in 2024, but they point to all the things you've already said. It is conflict and what conflict does to the environment. So when you think about how it damages resources and access to clean supplies and things like that, and just disrupts the delivery of life-saving vaccinations, all of those things come into play. And so anytime we have conflict or war, we will continue to see the spread of disease like this.
Yeah. I know one of my favorite quotes, I forget who said it now off the top of my head, but it's basically, the only thing certain about viruses is the uncertainty about viruses.
Seriously.
It's just, they're really, especially when they have different ability. And while polio does tend to primarily be a human host issue, it can survive in water and on surfaces for 5-10 days, things like that. So, you have an environmental factor with that one as well. So there's windows of time that the virus can absolutely escape the host and still be a problem.
Yeah, I always wonder. I always figured that polio would have been eradicated by now. The first strain, but it hasn't been. Is this something that's out of reach for us, just because of the world?
I hope not.
Yeah.
It's such a devastating, and I still think, in all honesty, we don't really know how scary it was. We didn't live in the time period when it was affecting our children. And so I hope not. I
I
hope
don't
that
know.
we can
It
find
just
a
seems
way.
like as the numbers get lower and lower, it seems like there's more and more stumbling blocks to
Yeah,
get over that last hump.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, to be clear, when you look at the organizations that would know best, when you look at, WHO's report of, opinions from all these groups pulled together, they're like, eradication is absolutely possible. It
Right.
is possible.
Yeah.
It's absolutely possible. But so long as there's 2 endemic countries, it will not be possible. It has to get taken care of in those 2 areas, and then the vaccine-derived strain has to be handled, and also existing rates of immunity and immunization and everything have to stay at an
Right.
acceptable level as well. So it's like everything has to stay
A lot of
good,
moving
and
parts.
then yes, and so there is a promising novel oral polio vaccine on the, I think was FDA cleared or on the market now. I'm not sure. And to be totally transparent, I don't know a ton about it, but I know that has been rolled into one of the plans or some of the plans for helping make this more of a possibility. And I think it does get to some of the issues that feel like stumbling blocks for sure.
All right. Well, we're going to come to the close now. Any final thoughts from either of my polio experts today? No pressure.
I don't really have any final thoughts other than to thank you, Robert, and to my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Prinzi, for allowing us to talk about this. Probably my final thoughts are what I think Andrea and I talk about all the time, is how incredibly important it is for the public and your friends and family to understand these types of issues and infectious diseases. And you can learn a lot. You can learn a lot through using reputable sources, talking to people who work in this area, and just trying to avoid some of the misinformation, other things that you see circulating around these topics sometimes. Go to those reputable sources and ask questions of experts that can help you understand if you're having a hard time with vaccines and what to do about them, and how to treat things and things like that. So that's always kind of my last parting thoughts on these areas.
Andrea, anything?
I just think, thanks so much. And it's always great. I love doing science communication work with Rodney and really appreciate the opportunity. And I think any chance I get, I just like to remind or tell for the first time the general public that we've talked about this a lot today, but I think we live in this space, especially in the United States or in any higher income country. We think about diseases that maybe we experienced before, but we think they will never happen to us again. I think folks don't even, realize yellow fever used to be here, and malaria used to be endemic in the United States, and polio hit the US harder than most places for a while. This is something that we are not invincible. We have gotten to where we are today through the work of vaccines, public health, trust in actual science and reputable sources. This is like more important than ever. And these things can and will come back if we don't pay attention to our history. So I think it's really, really important to review our history, see where we've been before, what we did well, what we didn't do well, how we got here now, how we maintain where we're at. And just, and I'll be the first to say, I'm a clinical microbiologist. I'm also an outcomes researcher. I love this stuff, but I'm not a polio expert. I'm super interested in it. So I really would love people to go find the polio experts. Also read this book. I'll say it again, An American Story by David Oshinsky. I think it's really fascinating, easy to read, and helps you understand why this was like so devastating and important. And of course, US is not the only issue here. I mean, this is a global problem. Globally, this is an issue. I am biased because I live in the US and that's my perspective, but certainly this is a huge issue globally. And so I think everyone needs to pay attention. So.
Right on. Amen. Preach.
I want to go ahead and agree with both of my esteemed guests about that book. It is very good. And I'll link to that too if you'd like to take a look at it. And again, their article, if you want to check it out, it's on the asm.org website. It's called Polio's Last Stand, The Global Fight for Eradication. And that's by Doctors Andrea Prinzi and Rodney Rohde. And I'll put the link in the show notes if you want to check it out. It's worth taking a look at. And I want to thank you, Dr. Rohde, Dr. Prinzi. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert.
All right, you'll have a great day.
Take care, everybody.
Yes, sir.